Osama bin Laden, a figure etched into modern history, is believed to have been born on March 10, 1957. While there was long-standing debate about whether his birthplace was Jeddah, it is now widely accepted that he was born in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, came into the world in Yemen in 1908. During his youth, Mohammed's family relocated from Yemen to the western Arabian coastline, an area that was once contested territory between the Ottoman Empire and the House of Saud. By the 1930s, Mohammed had established himself as a prominent construction entrepreneur. He worked closely with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founding monarch of modern Saudi Arabia. Through royal favor, Mohammed's firm, the Saudi bin Laden Group, flourished as the kingdom grew wealthy from its massive oil reserves. Osama's mother, Hamida al-Latas, was originally from Syria, hailing from a prosperous citrus-farming family near Latakia. In 1956, at just 14 years old, she married Mohammed bin Laden, who was 48 at the time. Their union produced only one child, Osama, born a year later. The couple separated soon afterward, leading some to question whether they were formally married or if Hamida was simply a temporary partner. Osama's childhood was marked by privilege. By the time he was born, his father had already amassed a vast fortune, one that would amount to billions today after inflation adjustment. Following his parents' split, Hamida remarried her new husband. Mohammed al-Latas was once a business colleague of Osama's father. The couple went on to have 4 children together. Osama was raised in this blended household, growing up with half-siblings under the care of his mother and stepfather. Despite this, his biological father remained a significant influence, especially in shaping Osama's strict religious beliefs. In 1968, he began attending the Al-Thager Model School in Jeddah. 3 years later, in 1971, he briefly encountered Western culture when he traveled to the United Kingdom to study English at Oxford University. As a teenager, Osama had common interests like many boys his age. He supported the Arsenal Football Club and had a keen fascination with military history. While many elements of his upbringing seemed ordinary, his family's status was anything but. By the 1960s, the Saudi bin Laden Group had become one of the most influential companies in the Arab world. Its business relationship with the Saudi monarchy was deeply entrenched, including high-profile contracts for the maintenance and expansion of the grand mosques in Mecca and Medina. In 1964, the company secured a prestigious project to refurbish the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, a site of immense religious importance to Muslims. By that point, the bond between Mohammed bin Laden and the Saudi royal family had grown exceptionally strong. Tragedy struck in 1967 when Mohammed died in a plane crash at the age of 59. After the pilot miscalculated the aircraft's descent. Despite this loss, the family company continued to expand, now led by Mohammed's sons from earlier marriages. By the 1970s, the firm had diversified and grown into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise across the Middle East. During these years of business expansion, Osama remained uninvolved with the family's corporate operations due to his young age, instead focusing on his education. In 1976, at the age of 19, Osama bin Laden enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. Initially, he pursued studies in economics and business administration, possibly with the intention of one day taking on responsibilities within his family's influential business empire. However, those who knew him at the time noted that his primary interests shifted away from business. He became increasingly absorbed in religion, classical Arabic literature, and poetry. Financial concerns were never an issue for him. As a future heir to a substantial portion of his father's wealth, Osama was expected to receive at least $30 million. By this point in his life, he had already married. His first wife was Najwa Ghanem, a cousin on his mother's side. They married in 1974 when Osama was just 17. Najwa would be the first of several wives, and over the course of his life, Osama fathered more than 20 children. The late 1970s played a critical role in shaping Osama's beliefs. Though detailed records from this time are limited and often inconsistent, a general picture emerges. During these formative years, he began adopting a pan-Islamist worldview, one that advocated for unity among Muslims across all nations in order to defend and uphold their faith. This ideology was rooted in historical memories of the Islamic Caliphate, which had spanned vast territories from the 8th to the 11th centuries, governed from the capital city of Baghdad. This school of thought gained traction in the 1960s and 70s, especially as opposition to Western influence in the Middle East grew. Since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, after World War I, Britain and France had held considerable sway in the region. By the 1970s, their influence was fading, while the United States was becoming increasingly involved, a shift that pan-Islamist thinkers saw as unwelcome. These sentiments were intensified by the ongoing Israeli-Arab conflicts, particularly the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, with Israel receiving significant support from the U.S. A major intellectual influence on Osama during this period was Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian writer, religious thinker, and former member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was executed in 1966, but his writings had already become widely influential across the Islamic world. He promoted the idea that jihad, or religious struggle, was necessary to restore an Islamic order based on strict adherence to Sharia law. Qutb's works also carried a deep mistrust of Western civilization, portraying it as morally bankrupt and spiritually hollow. Osama was likely exposed to Qutb's ideology directly during his university years, as Sayyid Qutb's brother, Muhammad Qutb, was a professor at King Abdulaziz University. Muhammad actively disseminated his brother's teachings in Saudi Arabia, and Osama was reportedly among his students. By 1979, Osama completed his education at the university. Whether or not he earned a degree remains uncertain. The timing of his departure from university coincided with a period of upheaval in the Muslim world. The Iranian Revolution had just overthrown the Western-backed Shah and established a theocratic Islamic government led by Ayatollah Khomeini. At the same time, to the northeast in Afghanistan, political unrest was escalating. In 1978, the Marxist-oriented People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, said PPA, had taken control and was attempting to construct a secular, socialist regime, sparking resistance and setting the stage for wider conflict. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDA, had long-standing associations with the Soviet Union. Russia's interest in Afghanistan wasn't new. It dated back to the 19th century, when the region served as a strategic buffer between the Russian Empire and British-controlled territories in South Asia. However, despite their ideological alignment, there's little evidence to suggest that the Soviets orchestrated the PDPA's takeover in 1978, once the Marxist regime assumed power in Kabul, though close ties were quickly established with Moscow. By 1978 and into 1979, opposition to the PDPA's secular, leftist agenda began to swell. Islamist groups and other factions, discontented with the new regime, launched uprisings. As the government's control faltered, they turned to the Soviets for assistance. Initially, Moscow responded with limited aid, but as the PDPA's position weakened, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale military intervention at the end of December 1979. By early 1980, Soviet forces had deployed tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks, occupying key urban centers across Afghanistan. Before this invasion unfolded, Osama bin Laden had already traveled to neighboring Pakistan. Shortly after completing his university studies, Pakistan would become a central hub for militant activity throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Publicly, the Pakistani government opposed Islamic extremism, yet in practice, its rivalry with India, particularly after the 1947 partition, often led it to tolerate or even quietly support radical groups operating from within its borders. Bin Laden's journey through Pakistan would shape much of his future. Upon arriving there in 1979, he fell under the influence of Abdullah Azam, a Palestinian cleric and ideologue who would go on to inspire many prominent jihadist leaders, as emerged young Muslims, including Osama, to join the armed resistance against the Soviet incursion in Afghanistan. These fighters would become known as the Mujahideen, those who wage jihad or holy struggle throughout the early 1980s. Osama began investing his personal wealth into the recruitment, training, and arming of these Mujahideen fighters. Though his financial contributions were significant, they were overshadowed by the immense support provided by the United States and Saudi Arabia. Billions of dollars flowed into the region as part of a coordinated effort to turn Afghanistan into a frontline battleground in the Cold War, using the Mujahideen as proxies to counter Soviet expansion. While some conspiracy theories have overstated the extent of direct U.S. support to Osama himself, it is clear that he had at least limited contact with American operatives in the region during this time. Still, he operated mostly independently, building his own network and infrastructure in support of the jihadist cause. The conflict that followed fit a historical pattern. As in past foreign occupations, the Soviet military managed to secure the country's major cities with overwhelming force, committing around 80,000 troops by the end of 1980. However, the mountainous terrain, particularly in the Hindu Kush region of the north and east, favored guerrilla tactics. Mujahideen forces, both moderate and hardline, effectively dominated the countryside, turning the war into a protracted and bloody insurgency that would drag on throughout the 1980s. The war in Afghanistan became increasingly brutal as Soviet forces resorted to indiscriminate aerial bombings and the destruction of rural villages in an effort to crush the growing insurgency. By the mid-1980s, the humanitarian toll was staggering. Nearly one-third of Afghanistan's population, around 4 million people, had been displaced. Hundreds of thousands fled across the borders into Pakistan and Iran, while death toll estimates range from at least 500,000 to as many as 1.5 million. The conflict soon drew comparisons to the United States' experience in Vietnam, as Soviet troops found themselves entrenched in a war they could not win against a decentralized and highly motivated guerrilla force. During this period, Osama bin Laden emerged as a prominent figure within the Mujahideen. Initially, his role was logistical, coordinating supplies and facilitating the travel of volunteers from Saudi Arabia and other Arab nations to Pakistan. There, they were trained and armed before joining the fight in Afghanistan. Bin Laden frequently moved between the training hubs in Pakistan and the Mujahideen-controlled zones in the mountainous Hindu Kush. In 1984, together with his mentor Abdullah Azam, bin Laden founded Maktab al-Qadamat (IMK), or the Office of Services. This organization became a central fundraising and recruitment hub, drawing financial support from wealthy individuals in the Arab world and sympathetic donors in the West. The funds were used to arm and train Mujahideen fighters. By 1986, bin Laden had established a base in eastern Afghanistan known as Al-Masada, or the Lion's Den. From there he led operations, including the Battle of Jaji in 1987. Though the battle itself held little strategic value in the broader war, it became a defining moment in bin Laden's rise. His personal involvement and the media coverage it received, notably from young Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, helped shape his image as a warrior leader in the Arab world. Despite the differing worldviews between the two men, the founding of Maktab al-Qadamat was pivotal. It created the infrastructure for what would become a global jihadist movement. As the Soviet occupation neared its end in the late 1980s, internal debates emerged about the organization's future. Some members advocated for maintaining a focused regional mission, but bin Laden and Azam had broader ambitions. They envisioned a transformation from a regional resistance group to a global movement aimed at expelling foreign influence from all parts of the Muslim world. In 1988, this vision materialized with the founding of Al-Qaeda, meaning the base or the foundation. What began as a modest network of veterans and militants would grow into the most infamous jihadist organization in the world. From the outset, Al-Qaeda's objectives extended far beyond Afghanistan. The group aimed to wage jihad against non-Muslim powers across the traditional Muslim world, including the Middle East, North Africa, the Maghreb, Central Asia, and beyond into sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Central to its ideology was the belief in removing American military and political influence from Muslim lands and the destruction of the State of Israel, which it viewed as a Western imposition in the heart of the Islamic world, as its leaders realized that they lacked the resources for conventional warfare. Al-Qaeda embraced asymmetric warfare, terrorist tactics, as its primary strategy. Over time, the group concluded that provoking a larger-scale conflict with the United States was the most effective way to galvanize the Muslim world and draw recruits to their cause. Al-Qaeda also saw moderate Muslims as having strayed from authentic Islamic teachings. The group aimed to impose a strict version of Sharia law throughout Muslim-majority regions, grounded in a literalist understanding of the Quran. When Al-Qaeda was formed in 1988, the war in Afghanistan was already nearing its conclusion. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become the Soviet leader in 1985, openly declared his goal to withdraw from Afghanistan. However, like the US in Vietnam, the Soviets could not leave immediately. In fact, Soviet troop numbers initially surged in a last-ditch attempt to turn the tide of the war. This strategy faltered as the Reagan administration continued to supply large quantities of aid to Afghan fighters. Once Mujahideen forces were equipped with American-made Stinger missiles capable of downing helicopters, the balance began to shift dramatically in their favor. A year before the war ended, in 1988, several nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, signed agreements aimed at ending the conflict. Soviet forces began their withdrawal and had fully exited by 1989. In the wake of their departure, the communist government in Kabul rapidly lost territory and eventually fell in 1992. However, the end of Marxist rule gave way to infighting among Mujahideen factions. A brutal civil war erupted, lasting 4 years until the Taliban, a hardline Islamist group, gained the upper hand in 1996. Yet they never gained total control, especially in the north, where opposition groups such as the Northern Alliance remained strong into the early 2000s. During this period, tensions between bin Laden and the Saudi government escalated, while Riyadh maintained close ties with the United States. Bin Laden increasingly adopted a hostile stance against Western powers. A key disagreement centered on the civil war in South Yemen, where bin Laden urged the Saudi monarchy to launch a direct military intervention against the Soviet-aligned Yemeni Socialist Party. The royal family, however, refused. Another turning point came in 1990, when Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait on August 2nd. Hussein, who had previously received U.S. support during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, now sought to annex one of the world's wealthiest nations. His swift occupation of Kuwait triggered a global crisis. The United States soon began organizing an international military coalition to force Iraq to withdraw, gaining the backing of many Western and Middle Eastern countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. As the standoff with Iraq continued into late 1990, American troops were deployed to the Gulf region in preparation for potential conflict. The coalition forces, led by the United States, began assembling in Saudi Arabia, using it as a strategic base for what would eventually become a full-scale military response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. When diplomatic efforts failed, the offensive named Operation Desert Storm by the U.S. was officially launched on January 16, 1991. From the start, bin Laden fiercely opposed the military deployment. He was enraged when the Saudi leadership accepted a plan proposed by U.S. Defense Secretary Dick Cheney that called for American troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia to deter further Iraqi aggression. In protest, bin Laden sought an audience with King Fahd, offering to mobilize his own veteran fighters who had been battle-hardened during the Afghan War to defend Saudi territory instead of relying on Western troops. The king rejected this proposal, and the presence of foreign military personnel in the kingdom continued to grow. In response, bin Laden began a sharp public condemnation of the Saudi monarchy. He accused the royals of betraying Islam by allowing non-Muslim forces to occupy the land that hosts Islam's most sacred cities, Mecca and Medina. He also attempted to rally religious scholars, the ulama, to denounce the deployment through a formal fatwa, but this campaign failed to gain traction. These actions caused an irreparable rift between bin Laden and the Saudi royal family. By 1991, he was expelled from the country. Meanwhile, the Gulf War proceeded rapidly. By the spring of 1991, Iraqi forces had been pushed out of Kuwait. However, the United States chose not to remove Saddam Hussein from power. After his exile, bin Laden relocated to Sudan in 1992. The country had undergone significant political change just a few years earlier, when Colonel Omar al-Bashir seized control through a relatively peaceful military coup in 1989. Al-Bashir implemented Islamic law across the nation, turning Sudan into a sanctuary for Islamist militants like bin Laden. Bin Laden was invited to Sudan by Hassan al-Charabi, a high-ranking political figure and influential Islamist thinker. Soon, bin Laden settled into a fortified compound in the country, where he was protected by heavily armed al-Qaeda operatives. He built training camps on the outskirts of Khartoum and acquired a large residence in the capital, establishing Sudan as a hub for jihadist operations. This drew the attention of the United States. With al-Qaeda's activities expanding post-Gulf War, the CIA and other intelligence agencies began closely monitoring bin Laden. Surveillance flights and intelligence-gathering operations over Sudan became routine. By 1996, international pressure, especially from U.S. sanctions, had begun to seriously impact Sudan's already fragile economy. Political shifts within the Sudanese regime also affected bin Laden's position. President al-Bashir had sidelined his main supporter, Hassan al-Charabi. These developments led Sudanese authorities to quietly expel bin Laden. Later that year, he returned to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had just secured significant control of the country. Bin Laden was warmly received by Mullah Mohammed Omar, the Taliban's spiritual leader, and was offered safe haven under the new Islamic Emirate. In August 1996, Osama bin Laden publicly declared war on the United States through a number of Islamic media outlets. He accused the U.S. of maintaining a military occupation of Saudi Arabia since the 1990th Gulf War, and labeled it the main backer of Israel in the Middle East. Analysts have suggested that bin Laden's increased hostility at this point may have been influenced by both the financial losses he suffered after leaving Sudan and the humiliation of being forced out. The Sudanese government's decision to expel him, prompted in part by U.S. sanctions, may have further intensified his resolve to wage open jihad against the American government. Upon his return to Afghanistan in 1996, bin Laden and al-Qaeda began to fully commit themselves to violent anti-American operations. Although terrorism had always been a key element of al-Qaeda's tactics, the focus now narrowed sharply to direct confrontations with the United States. In fact, evidence of al-Qaeda's long-standing intent had already emerged earlier in the decade. Back in 1990, the FBI had raided the home of El-Sayed Nosair, an al-Qaeda associate based in New Jersey. During the search, authorities discovered plans referencing attacks on prominent New York City buildings. Just a few years later, in 1993, a truck bomb exploded in the parking garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The attack, which killed 6 people and injured hundreds, was orchestrated by Ramzi Youssef, a known al-Qaeda operative trained in Afghanistan. Prior to 1992, bin Laden had financed and coordinated a bombing at the Gold Moha Hotel in Aden, Yemen, targeting U.S. troops en route to Somalia. Al-Qaeda's operations weren't limited to one region. In 1997, the group was widely suspected to have played a role in the Luxor massacre in Egypt, where 6 gunmen killed 62 people, mostly Western tourists, at a popular archaeological site near the Valley of the Kings. This attack further signaled al-Qaeda's willingness to target civilians and international visitors in pursuit of its ideological goals. By the late 1990s, It was clear that Al-Qaeda had significantly escalated its global terror campaign, placing Western nations and the United States, in particular, at the center of its crosshairs. Al-Qaeda's campaign of violence escalated significantly on August 7, 1998, with coordinated truck bombings in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The targets were not chosen at random. Both attacks were aimed directly at U.S. embassies, sending a clear message. The Nairobi bombing used around 500 cylinders of TNT, while the Dar es Salaam attack involved 2 massive 2,000-pound explosives. Ammonium nitrate was used to enhance the blast's impact, maximizing destruction. These bombings killed 213 people in Kenya and 85 in Tanzania, injuring thousands more. The near-simultaneous nature of the attacks highlighted the growing sophistication of Al-Qaeda's operations. In the wake of the embassy bombings, Osama bin Laden was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Western intelligence agencies began to take serious notice of Al-Qaeda, although the true scale of the threat was still underestimated at the time. Following these attacks, bin Laden intensified his anti-American rhetoric. His list of grievances included U.S. support for Israel, as well as backing regimes that were, in his view, oppressing Muslim populations such as Russia in Chechnya, India in Kashmir, and the Philippine government in Mindanao. However, his main complaint remained the continued presence of American military forces in Saudi Arabia, particularly near the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In 1998, Al-Qaeda issued a declaration stating, "For 7 years the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of places." After the embassy bombings, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda began planning an even more ambitious operation, a direct attack on American soil. The target was once again the World Trade Center in New York City, the same location Al-Qaeda had attempted to bomb in 1993. But this time, the plan was far more destructive. The idea for a more devastating strike on the U.S. originated with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, an Al-Qaeda affiliate who proposed the concept in 1996. Bin Laden gave his approval in late 1998 or early 1999. Over the next year, Al-Qaeda selected operatives for the mission, men who could speak English, blend into Western society, and function effectively in the United States. Among them were Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shai, Zaid Jarrah, and Hani Hanjour, the latter already holding a commercial pilot's license. By 2000, 19 individuals had been chosen and were being organized into cells across Florida, Arizona, and California. Planning accelerated, and by early 2001, specific targets had been finalized. These included the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. A fourth plane was reportedly intended to strike the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., with preparations complete and operatives in place. September 11, 2001 was chosen for the attack. It's widely believed this date was symbolic, 9/11, matching the U.S. emergency phone number, amplifying the psychological impact of the event. It is widely believed that Osama bin Laden selected September 11 for the attacks, not only for its symbolic connection to the 911 emergency number, but also because of its historical significance. On September 11, 1683, King John Sobieski III of Poland successfully broke the Ottoman siege of Vienna, halting the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into southern Europe. This event marked a pivotal moment in the struggle between Christian and Muslim forces in the eastern Mediterranean and Balkans, and it is thought that bin Laden viewed this date as symbolic of a reversal of fortunes, marking a new phase where Islam would take the initiative once again. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers, divided into independent cells, began their coordinated operation. American Airlines Flight 11 departed from Boston's Logan Airport at 7 trim. 5:09 a.m. headed for Los Angeles, with 5 hijackers aboard. United Airlines Flight 175 followed suit, also leaving from Logan at 8:14 a.m., heading for the same destination. At 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Washington Dulles near Washington, D.C., with 5 hijackers. Finally, United Airlines Flight 93 left New Jersey's Newark Airport at 8:42 a.m. carrying 4 hijackers. The coordinated attacks began almost immediately after takeoff. At 3:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York at an estimated speed of 750 km. While many initially believed it to be an accident, Flight 175 turned sharply, and at 9:03 a.m., it struck the South Tower at 800 km. At 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Virginia. Flight 93, which had been aiming for another high-profile target, likely the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., was diverted by passengers and crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. The consequences of the crashes were catastrophic. At the time of the attacks, tens of thousands of people were in the World Trade Center. The initial impacts and subsequent fires caused the tower's elevators to fail, hindering evacuations. As the fires spread, people were forced to leap from the upper floors, unable to escape the inferno. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m., followed by the North Tower at 10 in total. Over 600 people died at the World Trade Center, including passengers and crew aboard the planes. The Pentagon attack claimed the lives of 125 people on the ground, along with 59 on board the plane. All 40 passengers and crew aboard Flight 93 perished. The scale of devastation made the September 11 attacks the most catastrophic terrorist act in history. The media coverage of the attacks began almost immediately, and the images of the planes striking the towers became some of the most widely seen images in history, amplifying the psychological impact of the events. Initially, Osama bin Laden publicly denied playing any role in planning the September 11 attacks in the United States. On September 16, a statement attributed to him was aired by Al Jazeera, in which he distanced himself from any involvement. Despite this denial accumulating evidence in the months and years afterward supported claims by U.S. intelligence that bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network had orchestrated the attacks. In 2004, Al Jazeera released a video in which bin Laden admitted he had overseen the operation carried out by the 19 hijackers who boarded the 4 planes on September 11, 2001. Additional confessions surfaced in 2006, accompanied by video clips showing bin Laden interacting with several of the hijackers in the lead-up to the attacks. In those recordings, he also claimed the motivation behind targeting the World Trade Center was to symbolically retaliate for the destruction of high-rise buildings in Beirut during Israel's 1,982nd invasion of Lebanon. At the time of the 9/11 attacks, bin Laden was thought to be hiding in Afghanistan's White Mountains, located in the eastern region near the Pakistani border. In response, President George W. Bush's administration swiftly passed a joint resolution on September 18, 2001, authorizing military action against those deemed responsible for the terrorist acts. Since the Taliban had been sheltering bin Laden and his network since the mid-1990s and refused to surrender him, the entire regime became a target. Airstrikes by the U.S. and British forces began on October 7, 2001, focusing on critical Taliban infrastructure. Meanwhile, the U.S. coordinated with the Northern Alliance, which had maintained control over portions of northern Afghanistan. American special forces had quietly entered Afghanistan in limited numbers as early as late September, but the main ground offensive started on October 19 with large deployments of U.S. and Allied troops. The initial phase of the military campaign saw quick success. By early November, U.S. forces had surrounded Kabul. On November 12, an air raid killed Mohammed Atif, a top-ranking al-Qaeda leader and close associate of bin Laden. The next day, Northern Alliance troops and their American allies entered Kabul as Taliban fighters withdrew to the mountains or moved southward toward Kandahar. The Taliban's last major stand occurred there in late November. By early December, they had surrendered, signaling the collapse of organized Taliban resistance. Around the same time, a transitional government was formed, with Hamid Karzai assuming leadership as the interim president of Afghanistan. However, this early victory proved temporary, as the country soon descended into persistent insurgent conflict that U.S. forces struggled to contain. Despite the military campaign, bin Laden remained at large. As Kandahar was falling, intelligence reports indicated he was hiding in the Tora Bora cave complex in the White Mountains. In response, several hundred Allied troops, including 70 American Special Forces, other operatives, and Northern Alliance fighters, launched a search-and-destroy operation in the rugged terrain. The ensuing confrontation, now known as the Battle of Tora Bora, lasted nearly 2 weeks. U.S. intelligence agencies believe bin Laden was present during the fighting but managed to escape due to inadequate troop deployment in the area. It is widely believed that he fled across the border into Pakistan shortly afterward. By the early 2000s, Osama bin Laden had become the world's most hunted individual, with the U.S. government offering a $25 million reward for information that would lead to his capture or death. This amount was later raised to the $50 million in 2007, reflecting the continued urgency of the search for the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Despite global efforts, bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network continued to pose a significant threat to the United States and its allies for years afterward. Following his escape from Afghanistan in late 2001, bin Laden's exact location remained a mystery and the subject of much speculation. He was now a household name and the most recognizable fugitive on the planet, prompting him to live in secrecy. Even American intelligence has only a fragmented understanding of his movements throughout the 2000s. Most evidence indicates that he and several high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda found refuge in Pakistan, while the Pakistani government never officially acknowledged sheltering him. The political climate in Islamabad over the years had often shown tolerance toward various extremist groups. In bin Laden's case, however, open support was not politically viable. Nevertheless, efforts to locate him within Pakistan were often half-hearted, and cooperation from Pakistani intelligence was minimal at best. He is widely believed to have spent significant time in the Waziristan region, a rugged and remote area near the Afghanistan border, although occasional reports claimed he had crossed into Iran during the latter part of the decade. Most of these claims appear unreliable. In reality, bin Laden likely lived quietly in Pakistan with the implicit protection of influential figures within the country's military and political spheres. While in hiding, bin Laden and his followers continued to direct terrorist operations across various parts of the Muslim world. After 9/11, launching direct attacks on U.S. soil became far more challenging due to tightened security, especially in airports and other critical infrastructure. However, Western forces now had a growing presence in the Middle East, providing new targets for Al-Qaeda. In late 2001, American, British, and other coalition forces had established a long-term occupation in Afghanistan that would persist for 2 decades. Soon after, attention shifted to Iraq, where a stronger Western military presence was about to take shape. Following the collapse of the Taliban, the U.S. administration under President George W. Bush signaled its intention to confront other regimes it accused of supporting terrorism. Iraq, ruled by Saddam Hussein, who had remained in power since the Gulf War, became a prime focus. This new policy of regime change received less international backing than the Afghan invasion. Countries like France openly criticized the Bush administration, suggesting that the U.S. was using the events of 9/11 as a pretext for asserting control over oil-rich nations, labeling the move as modern imperialism. Nonetheless, in March 2003, the U.S., along with the United Kingdom and a few smaller allies, launched an invasion of Iraq. The justification was that Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction and had links to Al-Qaeda. Although bin Laden had often spoken out against the sanctions imposed on Iraq after the Gulf War, viewing them as evidence of American oppression, there is no credible proof that Saddam's regime had offered meaningful support to al-Qaeda. In many ways, the Iraq invasion mirrored the earlier campaign in Afghanistan in its early stages. A rapid military campaign led to the fall of Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime, and by May 2003, President George W. Bush declared major combat operations in Iraq complete. However, this declaration was premature. Much like in Afghanistan, the situation quickly descended into a prolonged insurgency. By the summer of 2003, various groups across Iraq had launched a violent resistance against the occupying U.S. forces. Among those involved was al-Qaeda, which played a key role in the emerging chaos. Bin Laden's strategy included stoking sectarian tensions between the country's Sunni minority and Shia majority, pushing Iraq toward a devastating civil conflict. One of the most infamous examples of this tactic came on February 20, 2006, when al-Qaeda operatives bombed the Al-Askari shrine in Samarra, one of the holiest sites for Shia Muslims. Though the explosion itself caused limited casualties, it sparked a wave of retaliatory violence across Iraq, particularly in Baghdad, where more than 1,000 people died in the resulting sectarian clashes. By the late 2000s, conditions in Iraq began to improve. A significant increase in U.S. troop deployment in 2007, along with key political developments, helped reduce violence to more manageable levels. Still, al-Qaeda did not cease its operations. From his base in Pakistan, bin Laden approved numerous attacks, including a deadly suicide bombing in March 2000 and 8th at the revered Imam Hussein shrine in Karbala, which killed 42 people and injured many more. Meanwhile, bin Laden had settled into a new residence in Pakistan. Around 2002, construction began on a heavily fortified compound in the city of Abbottabad, completed by 2005. The property spanned about 38,000 square feet and was enclosed by walls up to 5.5 meters high, topped with barbed wire. Designed for maximum security and privacy, the building featured few windows-used screens to obscure interior views, including one placed high enough on the third-floor balcony to hide bin Laden, who stood over 6 feet tall. Given its unusual structure and secrecy, it's difficult to imagine local authorities didn't suspect something. Bin Laden likely moved into the compound around 2006 with some of his family close associates. Abbottabad, notably, is not far from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. Bin Laden's dependence on this compound would eventually lead to his downfall. In 2009, U.S. intelligence tracked one of his trusted couriers, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a longtime associate believed to have been with him during the 2000 and first Tora Bora escape. The CIA discovered that al-Kuwaiti was based in Abbottabad. Surveillance efforts soon led them to the compound, which they found suspicious enough to warrant closer observation. With approval from Congress, a covert CIA operation was established on the ground in Abbottabad in 2010. The team used state-of-the-art drones and surveillance technology to monitor the location and its residents. Despite months of observation, they couldn't capture any definitive proof that bin Laden was inside. No photographs or intercepted communications could confirm it. Still, by early 2011, the circumstantial evidence strongly pointed to the compound being his hideout. President Barack Obama eventually gave the green light for a high-risk mission, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, on May 1, 2011, while it was midday in Washington, D.C. 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying members of the elite Navy SEAL Team 6 departed from a U.S. base in Afghanistan. Crossing into Pakistan under the cover of night, they reached the compound in Abbottabad around 12:30 a.m. local time on May soon. During the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, one of the helicopters crash-landed, but fortunately, none of the Navy SEALs were injured. Upon arrival, a short but intense firefight broke out with some of bin Laden's guards. The SEALs quickly advanced through the compound. Meanwhile, President Obama and his top military and intelligence advisors monitored the operation live from the White House Situation Room. As the team made their way to the second floor, they encountered and killed one of bin Laden's adult sons, and also Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, the courier whose trail had ultimately led intelligence to the Abbottabad compound. Continuing to the third floor, the SEALs located bin Laden himself. Their mission directive was clear: kill, not capture. There are differing versions of exactly what happened next, as various SEALs later claimed to have fired the fatal shots. However, the most widely accepted account attributes the killing to CL operator Matt Bissonette, who reportedly shot bin Laden at approximately 12:39 a.m. local time. Bin Laden was hit in both the body and head while standing in the doorway of his bedroom, after which he collapsed inside the room and died. When they examined the body, CLs discovered T500 in cash and 2 mobile phones sewn into bin Laden's clothing, suggesting he had prepared for a possible escape. In anticipation of his death, the U.S. government had already decided that bin Laden's body would be buried at sea to prevent any grave from becoming a rallying point for extremists. His body was bagged and transported aboard the functioning helicopter, while the compound was further searched for intelligence materials that could aid in counter-terrorism efforts or reveal more about bin Laden's operations over the years. The backup helicopters soon arrived to evacuate the rest of the team. By 0 p. Washington time, forensic tests had confirmed the body was indeed bin Laden's. President Obama then addressed the nation, officially announcing the successful completion of the mission. Around that same time, bin Laden's remains were taken to an undisclosed location in the Arabian Sea. Weighted down with iron and rocks, his body was buried at sea within 24 hours of death, in accordance with Islamic burial customs. Despite the symbolic significance of bin Laden's death, the global threat from Islamist extremism did not diminish. In fact, by the time of his killing, Al-Qaeda had already begun to lose its dominance to newer, even more radical factions. One key figure in this shift was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian militant who had become affiliated with Al-Qaeda in Iraq during the early years of the U.S. occupation. In 2006, al-Zarqawi and his inner circle formally established a new group, the Islamic State of Iraq. Over the following years, this organization expanded rapidly, eventually evolving into what the world would come to know as ISIS. Their methods were even more violent than those of Al-Qaeda, and they enforced an extreme interpretation of Sharia law, often targeting fellow Muslims who did not adhere to their views. By the early 2010s, as U.S. forces withdrew from Iraq, tensions grew between Al-Qaeda and the increasingly radical Islamic State of Iraq. Under Al-Qaeda's new leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the organization distanced itself from the Islamic State's brutal methods, leading to a complete split between the two. Remarkably, the group responsible for the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda, was now viewed by many jihadists as too moderate, while the Islamic State gained traction among newer extremist recruits. In the aftermath of the 2011 Arab Spring, Syria plunged into a devastating civil war. At the same time, Iraq became increasingly unstable following the U.S. withdrawal, creating a power vacuum. Seizing the opportunity, the Islamic State of Iraq, now led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, expanded its reach, capturing large areas of northern Iraq and eastern Syria. By 2014-15, the group rebranded as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant as ISIL, and shocked the world by declaring an Islamic caliphate over the territory it controlled. Their reign was marked by unprecedented brutality, even prompting condemnation from Al-Qaeda. Between 2014 and 2017, U.S.-led forces gradually reclaimed much of ISIL's territory. As of the early 2020s, the threat of Islamic fundamentalism appears to be waning. Contributing factors include rising living standards in the Middle East, a decline in U.S. interventionist policies, and improving diplomatic ties between Israel and several Muslim-majority nations. However, the epicenter of jihadist activity has shifted to Africa's Sahel region, stretching along the southern Sahara, where groups have destabilized countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso. Meanwhile, the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. Osama bin Laden remains one of the most consequential figures in the history of modern Islamic fundamentalism. His radicalization began in the 1970s, heavily influenced by Islamist thinkers like Sayyid Qutb. With the financial backing of the bin Laden family fortune and deep connections within Saudi society, he played a significant role in supporting the Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. Had his involvement ended there, bin Laden might have remained a minor figure in history, but following the Soviet withdrawal, he devoted himself to a broader Islamist agenda. His disapproval of the Saudi regime's cooperation with the West, particularly during the Gulf War, marked the beginning of his open hostility toward the United States and its allies. By the 1990s, Al-Qaeda had adopted a far more extreme ideology, reflected in deadly attacks such as the 1,998th U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa, which killed hundreds and injured thousands. However, it was the attacks on September 11, 2001 that secured bin Laden's legacy as a global symbol of jihadist terror. On that morning, 19 operatives under his direction hijacked commercial planes and killed over 700 people in just a few hours. The psychological trauma and the long-term physical and societal consequences of the 9/11 attacks would shape global security policies for decades to come. Most people vividly remember where they were and what they were doing on September 11, 2001, as the world watched in shock while news of the attacks and footage of the planes hitting the Twin Towers spread across global media. Life changed dramatically that day. Most people vividly remember where they were and what they were doing on September 11, 2001, as the world watched in shock while news of the attacks and footage of the planes hitting the Twin Towers spread across global media. Life changed dramatically that day. Sweeping security measures were introduced throughout the Western world, and wars followed in the Middle East for years afterward. Barely a week passed without headlines from Afghanistan, Iraq, or other regions scarred by conflict. These events eventually contributed to the rise of ISIL and sparked a massive humanitarian crisis, as millions of people fled war-torn Syria and Iraq in search of safety, many risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean. By then, Osama bin Laden was already dead, killed in a secret compound in Abbottabad after spending years in hiding. His life ended in a sealed-off building, but the legacy of his actions had already reshaped the world. What are your thoughts on Osama bin Laden? Should he have been captured alive and brought to justice in a courtroom? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching.